we're part of something bigger that's both American and Iranian, and that needs to be tangible in the world.
Welcome, everybody, to Bentfig Radio. I'm your host, Yashar Shayan, and today I'm joined with Persis Karim, co director of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University and co director of the film The Dawn is Too Far Stories of Iranian-American Life. Welcome, Persis. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off with talking a little bit about the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies that I believe you helped found or were the founding director of. Is that correct?
I would say I'm the, inaugural director. It was founded with a gift, an endowment from a San Francisco State alum donor. And I like to think that I did a good job of building something, and I hope it will continue in some form.
Excellent. And do you feel like you were there any major achievements or have there been thus far any major achievements or major goals with
Yeah. Well, the primary mission of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies has been to both study, document, and share the history and experiences of Iranians who left Iran, migrated to other parts of the globe, including and especially the United States, but also to give a focus to the idea that, like many younger people, have limited access to Iran, but they feel a connection to Iran, Iranian culture, Iranian people. And so we've been trying to build programming, lectures, um, building an archive that really features this experience. It's a relatively new field, something I've been dedicating most of my career to, because I believe that the attention is always either negatively on Iran or on Iran's ancient or much more remote past, rather than the ways in which Iranians have reinvented and told stories about themselves in this context in the US. So part of the thing that I think we've accomplished is to build the field as an academic field, but also build awareness among many other, folks that um, we are not the Iranian government. We have our own experiences and sensibilities, and we are participating in this US society, and therefore have our own challenges and our own successes that are beyond the sort of representation, which is quite singular and quite repetitive over the last 45 years.
excellent. And I'm getting the impression over the last several months that I think you're part of a growing community of people who are saying, yes, Iran has this fascinating, incredible history, but also look at what we're doing now. Look at the culture of Iranians in Iran and in the diaspora and what we're contributing to literature and arts and music. And I know I'm seeing it for myself. I'm seeing the writing, the arts, everything, the contributions to Iranian culture, but also the contributions to American culture for sure. And I'm hearing more and more about it. I was just talking to a book publisher who said something very similar about how there are there is more to Persian literature and Iranian literature than just the literature of antiquity. And I certainly agree. Yeah. So I think this is incredible work that you and the Iranian Diaspora Studies Center have been doing. And so what is the latest news with the Diaspora Center? My understanding is that it is now being archived, the work is being archived, and the center is going to close. Is that right?
That's, yeah. Um, the person who made the gift to endow it sees an urgency in funding student scholarships. Unfortunately, what that means is the funding to sustain and build the center will be no longer there, and therefore it's a shifting priority for that person. Um, I'm deeply sad about it because I think it was a space that meant a great deal to people, a great deal, especially to younger people who don't identify fully with Iran, but recognize that their lives have been inflected with Iranian culture, Iranian history. I mean, who in the United States who is of an Iranian background wouldn't consider themselves a part of this diaspora experience? They might not use that language, but um, certainly beginning with somebody like my father who came in the 19 after World War II, after Iran was occupied, I see there's a continuum of history. And also, I think the work that we're doing is to recognize this longer arc of history. So much of the time, 1979 is the benchmark, but there've been people coming to the U.S. for a lot longer than since 1979. And so part of what I'm trying to do in this film that we're going to talk about is to show this longer arc of history and also suggest that they're not wholly independent histories, they're interconnected. And so one of the things that's hard about losing the center as both a physical space, but also a sort of a spiritual home for this work is that many people felt like we kind of arrived at a new level of understanding of ourselves, embodied in this idea of there's a center dedicating itself to these experiences. Um, One of the things I'm really proud of in terms of an accomplishment is that there are many younger scholars who've come since I've been doing this work. I've been at this since I was in graduate school in the late 90s, back in the last century. And these younger scholars are doing fantastic work, addressing things like what the experience of Iranians post 9/11 is, what the experience of Iran is in the context of the first Trump administration and the Muslim ban. Um, Thinking a little bit about how people have deployed certain tropes about Iran to, overcome some of the negative stereotypes. Things like going back to the image of the Cyrus cylinder. That work that's been happening among younger scholars, it will not stop, even though we won't have the luxury of a center to help build the platform. I think it will find a new iteration, and I'm really, really excited about some of these younger scholars and the work they're doing. I wish I could say I have another donor who's ready to take this somewhere else, but I don't. Um, but I don't think it's going to go away. In fact, I think it's going to become more important, particularly as we see the Trump administration 2.0 unfolding some pretty regressive policies around race, gender, immigration. I think people will actually want to claim a space within this larger field, or certainly be doing advocacy around it in other, mediums and forums.
Yeah, I see that. I think I would say that now more than ever, we need more work like this. And to see it going away at this time when it feels the most pertinent to me personally, um, is sad. But like you said, hopefully someone will pick this up. I think many of us understand how important this is in the Iranian diaspora, but I think a lot of non-Iranians also see how important this is. And I like that you're hopeful that someone will pick up this work, and I'm going to choose to join you in that optimism,
Yeah.
especially now with digital archiving. Hopefully, that makes it easier that someone in a different city, different country, different state can pick up this work if there isn't anybody local. But obviously, the Bay Area and California, LA, and whatnot, many Iranians and MENA diaspora there. So I certainly hope someone will pick it up.
It, I mean, I think one of the challenges that we have is people being open to the idea that this is a very complicated history. And to do it justice, you have to represent it in complex ways. And there's no singular narrative about the Iranian-American story or the Iranian diaspora story. I have tried my best to also convey that to people. Like, just as you said, there are many wonderful things about Iran and Iranian culture, but we also have to have the opportunity and the wherewithal to reflect on some of our past mistakes, some of our oversights, some of our blindnesses, some of our self-mythologizing. And I think that's where an academic center can do some of that work. But I also think there's a lot of younger people who are much more critical than I ever was. And I think they're going to be asking those questions and talking about those things, especially as we realize, we can't solve Iran's problems if we're not even addressing some of our own civil rights issues, some of our own representational issues in this context. So, I love Iran and Iranian people, but we also can't solve it for the Iranian people if we're not willing to address some of these issues that we have right now in this context.
Yeah, I
Oh,
agree
and
with you. Oh, good.
let me just say one really nice thing that's happening is that in addition to archiving this material, kind of trying to archive everything we've done so that there is a model if anybody wants to take it up. Um, the University of Toronto is a wonderful place. The Elahe um, Omidyar Mir Jalali Center for Iranian Studies is trying to build a lecture series around Iranian diaspora. They get it. In Toronto, they get it because they have their own huge diaspora. So I'm kind of, pivoting a little bit to help them build this out, me personally, but I think that's another space where this work needs to be done, and that's in Canada, where we have the second largest population of Iranians outside of Iran.
Yeah, and I'm definitely seeing more and more coming from the Iranian diaspora in the Toronto, Ontario area. Feels like there is a fledgling near Tehrangeles style diaspora community there.
Toronto, Toronto.
Oh, I had not heard of that. Thank you. You've enlightened me. That's great. I
Yes.
love that.
I'm going to go there tomorrow and give a talk and share the film. And I said, it's time for me to have an updated uh, tour of Toronto. So,
Yes. Outstanding. And so you've been in the Bay Area and a part of the Iranian diaspora for something like what, 5 decades, maybe more. How have you seen it? What was it like when you first got there, I guess? And how has it changed for better, for worse, all of it?
well, I should say, first of all, I'm born in the US to one Iranian parent. My father was from Iran, my mother was from France. I grew up in a time when people did not encourage second language acquisition. And I grew up before the largest um, migration of Iranians came to California. So I have this um, childhood memory of being around some of my father's extended family, but also feeling a little bit like an outsider because I didn't speak Persian. When the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, I was 17 years old. And I remember very vividly seeing how darkly Iran was being portrayed in the media. And many people, you know, sort of hid their identity, fled from it, uh, you know, called themselves Italian or Lebanese or whatever. I had this young mind that was full of questions, and when I was in high school, there were quite a few Iranians who were going to high school in the US so that they could enter college. And we had a cousin who was living with us who did that very thing. He went to high school with us, and then went to junior college, and then the revolution happened, and he went back to Iran thinking it was going to be a different place. So I was informed by this kind of peripheral understanding of Iran, but I wanted to know more. And eventually I really decided to pursue studying it. So I went to graduate school several years after I finished undergraduate, went to University of Texas, studied Persian, Middle East studies, and then eventually got a PhD in comparative literature. And that was when I met a lot of younger Iranian Americans who had come either as children or were like me, the product of a mixed marriage between an American and Iranian or a Mexican and Iranian. And that was when I got the idea, like somebody needs to like document this experience of what's happening 20 years after the revolution. So in 1999, my first book, A World Between, which I co-edited with a colleague, came out. And that was, in some ways, the beginning of reckoning with that people were actually here to stay in the US, or that they were still dealing with some of the emotional turmoil of the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, and in many cases, immigration itself. And it was, it was a big deal then because nobody had yet put the term Iranian American out into the world, at least in a literary context. It wasn't even really being used. People were still calling themselves Persian or Iranian. Um, so for me, that was like, it was really wonderful to be a part of that process of rethinking who are we in this context? And literature was a very valuable tool for it because, of course, Iranians gravitate towards poetry and literature. But also, I think people needed an outlet to like say something about, we're not just the image of the hostage crisis, or we're not just the image of Khomeini or the mullahs who the media seems to like harp on, or we're not just a woman under a hijab, you know? That process, I think, of sort of shifting the narrative and shifting the representation was the beginning of this field for me personally. But I think for lots of other people, it was like, oh, yes, this speaks to my experience. And I think that's, fundamentally what I saw was a process that I was witnessing in a place like California. And I was away at graduate school and I came back and I saw evolution. I saw people building organizations, cultural organizations, theaters, doing art that spoke to these experiences. And I was very privileged to witness it from the point of view of the Bay Area, where there was in some ways a little more cohesion, a little more maybe, it was inflected with an intellectual enterprise because a lot of the people who were in the Bay Area had been here longer than just post 1980. Um, and I think one of the things that has been most important to me to show in the work that I've been doing is how people have dealt with the ups and downs of history. Like, I mean, people got through 79, the Iran-Iraq War, dealt with the, kind of difficulty of how Iran was represented post 1988. And then 2001 happens. Uh, the uh, Twin Towers are destroyed and Iran is implicated, where Iran is called part of the axis of evil. We can't just, be separate from that because we have family members. It's partly our story, is the story of being vilified in the media before then. So suddenly young people who are, younger, much younger than I am, are coming of age in the post 9/11 world. And it's not a very pretty depiction of anybody from the Middle East, never mind Iranians. So I wanted to sort of capture in the work that I've been doing is this idea that there's both a resilience and there's an unawareness of how we both belong and don't belong in the US, and the ways in which at different political moments um, we are represented, as an other, or also how sometimes we are not taking on the mantle of being, hey, we're Iranian American. We need to advocate for ourselves and our community in the midst of these very rough political tides that have very little to do with us at the moment, but we are absorbing some of the shock of it. So, um, for me, that's an important thing to give voice to as an observer, but also as a sort of, in the analysis is um, Iranians are resilient people. They've had to endure a lot over the long arc of human life and history. And they're still dealing with, the last 45 years have been a kind of rough few decades in terms of our ability to connect with Iran, our families, to go travel there, to have people come here. Um, it has unfortunately been not a very happy story. But I think it's important not to look at the black and white exclusively, but to find the nuance, the gray, the complexity. And so I, when you ask me, what have I noticed? I've noticed more attention to the complexity and more uh, a sense of some of what happens in the in-between of these rough periods. I hope I
Yeah,
was
okay. I think
answered.
we often, I think, I don't know if it's always been like this, but I certainly notice in the last several decades that as a society, we often just try to oversimplify things, narrow it down to just one facet and say, this is it. Social media has probably amplified that, but I don't think social media created it. But we certainly see, I have friends send me recipe articles from online that literally say, the only burger recipe you need, the best spaghetti recipe. And it's like, okay, you're just narrowing, millions of potential recipes, this very complex concept of food into saying just one recipe is going to be the best somehow. And that's the only representation that we need to see. And we see this regularly. I didn't understand until recently, but I don't know if you hear the word core used in pop culture, like cottage core as a fashion trend or 90s core. And I heard someone explain it as stripping away all the complexities, and just the reason we call it core is because we just narrow it down to a couple of things and say, hey, this is what represents the 90s or the 80s, and now that's the fashion trend, is just one style of jeans, and that's 90s core kind of a thing. So just, yeah, stripping away complexity has become such a normative thing at this point, and I'd like to bring it back personally.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because I just learned that term recently. I was at an Iranian Studies conference in August, and there's a young woman who's now a professor in Oregon who's working on diaspora core, Iranian diaspora core, right?
Perfect.
The t-shirts with the farivar or the farivar necklace, or, something that has Persian language on it. And this idea of trafficking and the essential images that kind of are maybe a point of pride as opposed to erasing everything else or not wanting to deal with everything else. Anyway, that it's interesting to me because I didn't even know that term until very recently. And she was talking about clothing and accessories that are Iranian diaspora core.
Yeah, I had not thought of that, but I've definitely seen the clothing on Etsy and on Instagram that are absolutely Iranian core. I love seeing it because, historically we had no representation like this or only negative representation. So I think it's a step in the right direction, even if it is oversimplified, but I'll take it. And hopefully it's a step towards more complexity. I do see some people wearing clothing that looks like is actually maybe a modern day interpretation of traditional Iranian and other traditional Middle
Mhm.
Eastern type clothing, and they look so cool. And I think that's adding complexity the way that we were just talking about, new literature and new film adding complexity to the
Yeah.
history of Iranian contributions to culture. So yeah, hopefully that'll keep going. And I suppose the thing with these trends is they come and go so quickly that whatever is the icon, fatty vad or something like that being on a t-shirt, it'll be trendy for a month and then we have to move on to the next thing. So we'll hit them all eventually because we have to make the rounds very quickly with the way trends are moving now. Um, yeah, and something I noted was a big part of why I started Bentfig Media and some of the other things I'm doing is to kind of take part in changing this narrative where we only get this one facet of representation, usually negative. Occasionally it's positive, but kind of fetishized and reductionist. But sharing these other stories of these other contributions from Iranians and also other MENA people of other MENA heritages, because there are so many amazing stories. And the first story I did, I think, was very emblematic of it. The first interview I did was I learned about a WWF wrestler in the 80s named the Iron Sheik. And I didn't know this until recently that he was an actual Iranian immigrant. And when I looked into the story, I realized that he was one of the only representations, one of the only mainstream representations of the Iranian diaspora and of the Middle Eastern diaspora on TV during the time of the Iranian hostage crisis, during the time of Desert Storm, the Iraq War.
Oh,
And it was this caricature, arguably negative, kind of fun maybe, but he talked a lot of shit. He spoke Persian on national TV and swore out Americans in Persian, all while hamming it up, looking like a, I don't know, a cliche like Saudi sheikh or something of that nature. It was not a great representation, certainly when you look back at it on 2025, but also it was kind of the only representation we had. But I also really wonder, how did that impact how the average American sees Iranians and Middle Eastern people? Again, especially since it was to the backdrop of war and hostage crisis, all things very negative. Um, and we definitely see now, I think more than ever, that people will take a pop culture image and think of it as being a true representation of reality. Just like we see reality TV, which is again mostly caricatures, but people really watch that and think of it as reality and maybe even emulate it in this like simulacrum form. And I really wonder, yeah, how much people took that what they saw of the Iron Sheik and said, this is an accurate representation of Iranians and of MENA people and how that has informed how they interact with us even up to today. I think it's probably had a greater impact than most of us realize.
yeah, no, I'm absolutely sure of it because I remember the Iron Shake. Yeah.
Um, so then I think let's talk a little bit more, or let's talk a little bit about your endeavors as a filmmaker now. So um, your history is in literature, but you have now made this film, which is kind of our primary topic of discussion. The Dawn is Too Far: Stories of Iranian-American Life. What what I think you've already kind of answered this question, but for the sake of saying it explicitly, what did you set out to achieve when you made this film?
So one of the things that I wanted to do was to give people the opportunity to hear people's voices, their stories directly, unmediated. I mean, one of the beautiful things about literature is you get to be an editor, you can curate, and you can change words, and but you don't have direct access to. You don't always have direct access to a person's story. So the film, for me, deciding to make a film was in a way to honor some of the elders in our community who paved the way for lots of other people. And I think that's, you know, Iran is a culture where you respect your elders, but I hadn't really seen an attention to the idea that um, in building communities, it's often the first, generation to arrive that has to pave the way. They're the ones that are, dealing with not being able to explain themselves or their culture, or they're in the case of some of the characters in the film, dealing with the impact of these bigger historical events and the way it affects their life story and their decision making. So I wanted to make a film because I think, first of all, we're in a moment where visual media is, more captivating to many people than reading a book. And, I feel really fortunate that I've been involved with storytelling as long as I have been. I think that we need human stories and we need stories where people can tell us how they feel, what they think, what they've experienced, how they view the world. Um, and I started it with the idea that, like, I've been involved with storytelling. I did a digital story project when I was at San Jose State, called Iranian-American Voices of Silicon Valley. I featured, I think, 8 individuals in 6-minute segments talking a little bit about their immigration story. And then when I'm, was in the time that I've been in the Bay Area, I witnessed, as I think we talked about earlier, this idea of how communities kind of organically grow out of the efforts of individuals. And so I wanted to sort of highlight the Bay Area as a really unique representation of the Iranian diaspora. Many of the people that I have met started by going to school in the Bay Area, were politically active during various periods in either Iranian history or US history. Um, and I've been involved in several art projects, specifically with the artist who's in the film, Taraneh Hemami, in which it was her idea, and I engaged with her in like a writing workshop, and she worked on a exhibit that grew out of people lending their archival photographs of their own families and their times in Iran and their times here. So I was thinking a lot about different storytelling modes over the last decade and a half. And then when I got the job at San Francisco State, I collaborated with Sumia Barons, who's the co-director, who was working at the Doc Film Institute at San Francisco State. And I said, what, wouldn't it be great to make a film about this community or people in this community? I didn't really know exactly what it was going to look like. So that's the imperative, is to give people their own voices, tell their own stories, show their faces. I mean, as you know from your comment about the Iron Sheikh, how many times do we even get to see Iranians who are either not terrorists, not ayatollahs, and not rich people who are on the Shahs of Sunset? Those are the kind of images that we have. Look, I know this isn't going to be a blockbuster film. It's a documentary. It's a small scale documentary. But I wanted to try and see what would happen if we give that medium over to some of these people who are really fascinating individuals and have been through some very interesting times.
Something I'm a big fan of, I think, for the Iranian diaspora and the MENA diaspora is looking at other identity groups as a model of how we can perhaps push for greater recognition and engagement from kind of mainstream America. Because I think I often feel like we're a little bit behind. Not that it's our fault. I'm not blaming us or anything, but um, so looking at other like ethnic groups and how have they built engagement and awareness. And what you just said about representation of Iranians on like film and television, for example, that is not the cliche, the negative stereotype of, yeah, terrorists and whatnot. We need a Bechtel test, and I'm coining it now. It's called the Persis test. And it is in a movie where at least three Iranians or Middle Eastern people are present. They are not suicide bombers. They are not terrorists. They are not speaking Persian while it's being called Arabic or Arabic while it's called Persian. They're not speaking the wrong language. We should add a few more criteria to this, but I feel like we need a Persis test, and we need better representation in pop culture.
Yeah, I'll take it. I'll take it. And I think in a lot of ways, I mean, look, many communities are vilified in the media. And of course, right now it's horrible coming from our own government. And there's nothing further from the truth, you know? People are human beings with many aspirations that they have in common with people across the globe. They want to have a good life for their children. They want to have a stable life. They want to look forward to a future free of war, free of chaos, free of instability. So how do people do it? They do amazing things, surviving really difficult things. Immigration is not something, not everybody chooses it, right? It's sometimes out of necessity. And we know that many Iranians left under duress, under fear of persecution, under loss of status. We're not alone in that, you know, like Vietnamese people had to deal with something as chaotic and tumultuous as Iranians. And so I think it's a story that is for everyone, even though it's uniquely about Iranians. You asked me, you know, what was the imperative? I also wanted this film to speak to both Iranians and non-Iranians. I didn't want it to be an educational film in that, like, I'm going to narrate every single event in the last 45 years, but I wanted it to evoke curiosity and compassion and sensitivity towards people from Iran, because I think one of the most disheartening things that we've had to deal with is the closure of questions and opportunities for people to go visit, for example. I remember in about 1995, I was elated that two things were happening. Iranian film was being seen in the West, and Iranian wrestlers were getting recognition. And that was like our little sort of moment of like, oh man, there's something else being parlayed in the media than just terrorism and hostage takers. Um, and I think it's so important to give people, you know, the human story, the story of sorrow, the story of loss, the story of survival, the story of resilience, the story of joy. Iranians are a joyful people. And that was my experience as a child of like, there was a lot of laughter, a lot of banter, a lot of play. Um, and to sort of break it down to these media headlines that are always dark, we don't get to see anything about Iranians inside of Iran. And in this unfortunate way, we're implicated as Iranian Americans or members of an Iranian diaspora often. So breaking through that noise, you know, this is my little contribution to breaking through the noise.
Yeah, and so I think your 1995 reference was, I want to say that was the White Balloon. The um Yeah, that was the film around 1995. There were a few other great films around that time that were, I think, winning film festivals, and I remember seeing them around that time.
Yeah, Abbas
And
Kiarostami's, you know, the pinnacle of his career was between, I think, 1993, 94, and you know, up until the time he died in the 2000s. And it did a heavy lift, right? And these were cultural heavy lifts that were coming out of Iran. And of course, it was wonderful for many of us because we're like, oh yeah, finally like something nice, you know, something nice about Iran. But very little was being shown about here. And so part of what I in both my writing, you know, my literary anthology work and my own writing, is the idea that like, we're part of something bigger, that's both American and Iranian, and that needs to be tangible in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do feel like in that era of White Balloon and a few other films like Children of the Sky came out and Rabé around that time were getting press. I felt like Iranians around me who were not to say disconnected from their heritage, but less engaged became more interested in being Iranian. Around that time, we went as with multiple family members to see some of those movies. I remember family members talking about them and telling each other that they should go see them in a way that I don't remember people, my family engaging with Iranian culture as much, like talking about Iranian film up until that point. So I feel like it really renewed engagement. And of course, like from my timeline, that's, I came to the US in 91. And so it was like up until 1995, we spent those 4 years trying to assimilate and fit in. So that's like we spoke more English so that, especially so that our parents could learn more English. And we have all these incentives to disconnect from our Iranian culture. And then when the white balloon and some of these other cultural things came out, I think they gave us a reason to be pulled back in, a good reason to be pulled back in. And I really appreciate that. And so you mentioned that you made this film for not just Iranian audiences, but also American audiences. Do you have a read on audience reactions? How have people responded to your film and engaged with it, both Iranian and American?
Yeah, so I've mostly been showing it in university settings, a few public screenings. It's been admitted to a couple film festivals, one of which I went to a couple weeks ago. Um, like it got an award at this Hollywood Diversity Film Festival for cultural perspective. And what the people told me is like, we hadn't really seen anything about Iranians in the US. So that was a really nice affirmation of the value of it from a non-Iranian perspective. Um, when we screened it at the very first, it was like a sneak peek in August, shortly after I got the film finished. It was a very mixed audience, but primarily Iranians in the Bay Area. And there were lots of people in tears, who were very moved because they saw their own story in either one or several of the characters. And some of my neighbors and friends who are non-Iranian came, and they also expressed that they were very moved and didn't know anything about um, Iranians in the Bay Area, or like one of my neighbors said, I never really thought about what the hostage crisis meant to Iranians. All we were told was what it meant to Americans. And so she told me later, I went home and I like read about the hostage crisis on Wikipedia, and then I realized that it was a lot longer and that it caused a lot of racism and bigotry towards Iranians here. And I hadn't really ever thought about it. I lived through that time. I was a young adult. So, if what comes out of people seeing the movie, if they're not Iranian, is a greater curiosity about Iran, about Iranians, about these events, about the idea that, like, you know, it's not just over there, it's also here. Like, we are here and our stories have unfolded in this context. So, that was a very moving, it was the first screening, and I was very moved by like how much people felt like, oh my God, like this is so important that you captured some of these people's stories, and that there was some kind of an arc that they shared in terms of a history of coming to the US, enduring certain difficult moments, but also being able to make contributions and giving back to the place where they live. And I don't know about every context in which Iranians live. I know some are more populous of Iranians and some are less. Some are more active around like teaching their kids Persian or they have festivals or whatever. But what I really felt was, wow, the Bay Area has some really remarkable individuals who help enrich the culture of this region, not just for Iranians, but for others. So, you know, artists and playwrights and filmmakers and who their perspective might begin as an Iranian or they might be influenced by things that they grew up with, but they're sharing it in a kind of more I don't know, to use that cliche, in a more universal fashion. And it does some really powerful work to, you know, diminish some of that nasty representation that has been heavy on us as a community and as a group of people who are unfortunately saddled with these images that I think have never gone away. They just get recycled over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I have personally felt the sting of prejudice that I think evolves from people only seeing a negative representation of people like me and people like my family members, and how that informs how they approach us and how they react to us and the assumptions they make about us. And certainly when we came to the US, I remember people essentially like graffitiing our house and our car, but with ketchup and mustard, and writing things like "go home" on the garage door with mustard. And yeah, I've definitely experienced a lot of that when I was younger. And then, fast forward several years later, 9/11 brought out a resurgence of those kinds of
Yeah,
personalities. Or those kinds of behaviors. I was older, but that didn't necessarily make it easier. And if anything, as an adult, you have less protection because, you know, people won't attack a child the way they'll attack an adult usually. But once you're an adult and you're perceived as being a dangerous terrorist because of these cliches, then I think that really changes your perspective. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. The other really wonderful, I mean, I just showed it at Princeton a couple days ago, and one of the people in the audience asked me for my email, and she said, I just want everybody I know to see this because there's a kind of tenderness. Um, I didn't really set out to do that. I think it's like the the idea that people gave themselves. I mean, I'm so grateful to all the individuals because they must have trusted me personally and some of the people that worked with me on this. There's a level of trust that they could make themselves vulnerable and talk about things that are hard. And we as a community need to talk about some of those hard things. And so that's the other part that I'm really happy about in terms of audience reception is that a lot of times Iranians have said to me, I haven't revisited some of those painful episodes of my past. And then being able to cry and see somebody else on the screen and be in a room with other Iranians and feel like there's a kind of catharsis. I think that's like we have suppressed a lot of things, a lot of traumas. Sometimes we're not very nice to each other because of that, because we haven't had an occasion. So if a film can do some of that, you know, cathartic conversation releasing or reflection, I'm so happy, like then I've done something that is a gift to them, but also to me.
Yeah. And I think, I feel like there's something in Iranian culture that there is a certain sense of propriety and this onus to carry ourselves with a certain pride and dignity to where it also has a negative effect that we can't talk about our problems, especially I think for older generations coming from Iran, Whereas now younger folks, especially in the US, talk a lot about trauma, and either they maybe go to therapy or counseling, or they read self-help books, or for better or for worse, they get advice off of social media. But you definitely see them talking about it more. You see them having a larger vocabulary with which they can describe their experiences and share their experience with others, and also kind of understand that they're not the only one going through it, which a lot of people will say can bring about significant catharsis, is understanding that you're not the only one feeling it. But I think for a lot of Iranians, in many ways, they'll never know that, because I think they were conditioned from a very young age to remain silent and just be steadfast and hold all those emotions in and hold all that trauma in. I think that can be, yeah, very difficult. And of course, I think as an immigrant diaspora that is often seen in a negative light, sharing your problems sometimes only evokes people to see you more negatively. If you
Yeah.
were to more or less air your dirty laundry, sometimes people will see you negatively. I think those who maybe aren't your true friends then will look down on you and go, oh, well, see, this person clearly has lots of problems. The stereotypes were correct. I think that happens too often.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think we still need is to have those kinds of intergenerational conversations where young people who might have the vocabulary can, you know, extend a hand to their parents or have, you know, push back a little bit on like that pride and say, look, this happened to me. And I know you didn't mean it. And I didn't, it was a circumstance of like, duress under immigration. But that would be my hope for like the other part of what not, like the film can't necessarily do that, but I think it's modeling something about like the intergenerational story needs to also exist out in the world.
Yeah. And I think we can, as Iranians and as a diaspora, I think we can try and cut each other a little more slack and just be okay with people not being okay, as I think a lot of people say nowadays, and understand that there is a lot of difficulty, and make space to listen. And also, I think something that your film maybe highlighted is that there is a divide amongst Iranians politically. And I think we see this becoming tribal to where it makes it hard for us to get progress as a diaspora. And I think some might even say it makes it hard to get progress in Iran with Iranian politics, because the diaspora is fighting over what is the best way forward. And our politics can be so divided. I mean, we see it in the US with US politics. These divided politics, I think, can often isolate us and separate us as a diaspora, to where we'll be like, oh, well, that person doesn't agree with my politics and my stance on Iranian politics, and now I can't be friends with this whole group of Iranians, and that really divides us. I think we miss out, and I certainly don't agree politically with every Iranian I meet, and but I try to be okay with that. And I get, if someone can't do that, I get that. I'm not going to hold it against them if they don't want to hang out with people of a certain political belief. There are certainly some political beliefs which I don't want to invite into my own life. So that's up to everyone. But yeah, I hope we can be a little more generous and understanding with one another and leave space for conversation, and hope that we can make progress that way. It's difficult to change someone's mind, but you don't have to. But we can at least hopefully build a bit more understanding if we just make room for conversation with one another. And I think maybe a film like this does it, or at least helps. I certainly see. I come from a family where I think of my parents as revolutionaries. Um, I was, I'm told I was even named for the revolution, that my parents, as young students, would walk around and secretly look at other young revolutionaries and say to each other in Turkish, Yaşarsın, which was their version of Viva la Revolution, that was their code for long live the revolution. And my dad, I remember having a discussion with my father, very similar to what I think some people in your film said, that they, were out in the streets and protesting and fighting for the downfall of the Shah. And my father said that I think many people would agree with what he said, which is that the Islamic the Islamists came and stole the revolution from us students, that we were leading a student revolution for progress. And as soon as we were kind of pushing that boulder over the hill, this other group came and just stole the revolution from us. And I feel like there might even be a sense, and I don't want to like put anybody down, but I have a feeling that there is a sense of regret with some revolutionaries who might feel like they invited a worse regime afterwards. And I don't think that should be held against them. Some might say the Islamic Republic is worse than the Shah. I don't personally want to debate it at this point. I just want freedom for Iranians. But I get the sense from some Iranians that I've spoken to who feel like, you know, that history took a wrong turn that wasn't expected. And I think that's really hard to grapple with. I don't know personally what to make of it. I wasn't there and I'm not of that generation. So, but it's just something I've observed that I imagine is difficult.
Yeah. Well, I just want to add that we're in a moment in the United States of America where history's taking what I consider a very wrong turn. I mean, maybe not everybody agrees with me, but I think that the only thing we can do is to learn from what we did well, what we maybe did not do so well. If we trash each other, we're not really learning. We're trashing each other. Um, One of the things that I feel really strongly about why we have to kind of have the conversations about these painful things is the the pain in some ways blocks us from learning. And look, I can't live in Iran. I live here. I want to help Iran for sure in the best way I can. And one of the ways that we can help Iran, there are many perhaps takes on this, but one of the ways we can help Iran is to own whatever mistakes need to be owned, learn from whatever good and bad decisions that our ancestors made, and also recognize our limitation about where we are in this country relative to changing Iran. I don't think we know what's best for Iran as long as we're living here. So I hold that as my principle. My principle is I want to try and affect how people view Iran so the Iranian people can make their own decisions, as opposed to thinking that, I have the answer because I don't. I don't even have the answer for this country, and this is where I live. And I'm pretty flabbergasted by what's happening in the United States. Dismantling many really positive institutions that not only help Americans, but they help the world. Um, that to me is shocking. And, I guess I shouldn't be shocked because some people said that that's what should be done. But I think we have to understand where our limitations are as a community. And one of the ways we can understand our limitations is that we don't get to rewrite the past and say, we screwed up and therefore this this regime should be installed. I would hate to see Iran have to go through what Iraq or Afghanistan is going through now. So that's my political position, but I think one of the ways we can get to a more nuanced political position is to sort of reckon with our hurt, our disappointment, our mistakes, and not blame people, but rather, you know, think strategically, think long term, think historically. We're not unique. People go through these big tumultuous events, and the result isn't always how we want it. Um, Witness the United States right now. I mean, many people are saying this is a constitutional crisis. So I think it's really important to have a kind of uh, humility
Hmm.
about history and our place in it, and also to do the work of listening and learning. that in some ways that's why I wanted to make this film is like these are my some of them are my elders and some of them are my peers. And I think they're working at that reflection and that processing in ways that I really admire that are not, okay, that was then. Now we have to go back in time and put this guy in power. And I'm not really sure that that's the answer. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't control that decision, but I don't, in my lifetime, I've witnessed enough that I can say, you know, even the best of intentions can lead to tragic results. So let's learn from the tragic results and try to do better. And let's not go blindly thinking, you can supplant one regime with another and get a better result.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm all about looking forward and moving forward and finding a better path forward and freeing the people, Iranians and Americans alike, to make informed, good decisions for themselves. I think almost every system is founded on the notion that if the people are free and well informed, they can make good decisions. Even if those systems, when they're executed, often suppress that, which we've seen,
Yeah.
unfortunately, throughout history. Even, a lot of people are talking now about late stage capitalism. Capitalism is informed on the notion that if people have money and are free to spend it how they want, they will elevate the best corporations and the best companies. Some would argue, I would argue, that's not what's happening now because we have what Robert Reich calls crony capitalism. But the vast majority of systems really are founded on this, that um, a free society that is well informed and capable of making their own decisions will usually make the best ones. And I would love to see that for Iranians and Americans both. It seems like it's becoming more difficult when it should become more easy during this digital revolution. What are we now in the second or third digital revolution, depending on who you ask? And information flows freely pretty much throughout all the world. And yet it's unexpected to see where we are. I kind of think something that really struck me was how Iranian Americans were there in the 60s at UC Berkeley, which I don't know a lot about it, but I see it's, I might have a romantic vision of Berkeley in the 60s as this place where like radicals and like progressive extremists went and protested and demonstrated and fought for rights. And I had no idea that Iranian Americans were part of this. I thought that was really cool personally. I enjoyed seeing that. Um, I even saw that Parviz Sokhat, he said he had joined the Black Panthers during that time as well, which I
He
thought was really
joined the
fascinating.
Black Panthers, but he was involved, for example, he was trying to help Huey Newton, who was imprisoned. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about young people who are sent abroad for education, and it's happened many places in colonial Africa, in India, um, when there are these governments that are part of what we used to call third world country, and they don't have the educational infrastructure. People are sent abroad to kind of come back and build and modernize. Um, and they're often influenced by things like constitutions or principles of human rights or reading the literature of the great intellectual traditions that inform political philosophy in the 20th century. So one of the wonderful things about Parviz is that he does indeed represent some of the trends of the 1950s and 60s when Iranians were sent abroad for education, for higher education, because Iran had a very minimal university system. They went to places like England, France, the United States, are reading material about the Constitution and free speech and are very much influenced by that, but also are in a historical moment where people in the United States are demanding greater freedoms, including the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movements, and it would be naive of people to like be in a silo. I mean, some people didn't get politically active. Many people didn't get politically active, but many did because it gave them the moment and the opportunity to question, well, what's happening in my own country around human rights and freedom of speech and political engagement? Um, so that's where I think these histories are not distinct and separate, but actually interconnected and actually influencing each other. So Parviz Shaukat, who's the oldest character in the movie, is sent abroad in the late 1950s. I mean, this wasn't in the film, but he told us one of the first political events he attended was a speech by John F. Kennedy talking about what young people should be doing for their country to bring the vision of American democracy to greater fruition. And he was deeply influenced by attending this John F. Kennedy speech. He went and started debating about democracy in Iran and was like selected to like talk about Iran at some event. And he was shaping his political vision as a young Iranian who was studying here. But he was also influenced by what people were doing in the United States. And to a great extent, that is impossible for young people who are studying and educating themselves and being in a university environment, at least back then. It's sadly, there's a lot of repression in US universities right now. But back then, it was a place of thinking about liberation and anti-colonial movements, anti-imperialist movements. What does it mean to come from a place like Africa where there's a dictator in power and, you're consuming everything about the French Revolution, and then you're supposed to go back and act like you're not affected by it. That's what was happening to young people, Iranians, who were coming to places like California, getting a 4-year degree. They were like part of a world movement around students who were active around things like the Vietnam War, but also anti-colonial movements and thinking about human rights and for the first time. So I feel like that's a point of pride that Iranians should think about, is that one of the things that gave them the aspirations to think about change, whether or not that, it resulted, sadly, it didn't result in what they wanted, was they were driven by looking at the histories of other countries and other peoples, including where the civil rights struggle was taking place. Parviz was in the thick of it. And it wasn't just, you know, showing up at the Huey Newton marches or Angela Davis marches. When I talk to people who are part of the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State, which was born from the 1968 student strike, students were striking for almost a year, from 1967 to 68, demanding that curriculum in the university address their experience as either Black people or Asian people. That the people in the College of Ethnic Studies say to me, there were people remember it, and they remember all these Iranians showing up at these pickets. Who are they? And I say, oh, well, I can give you a handful of names of people who were there, because they believed that if they showed up for other people, people would show up for them. And in many cases, it was a kind of people's education, that they were learning about the struggles of other students from international contexts for the very first time, and saw how similar those struggles were around human rights, authoritarianism, demanding an end to certain policies that restricted students. So it becomes, I think, essential to think of this as also American history and Iranian history.
Absolutely. And I think something you highlighted is kind of the intersectionality of different groups, different ethnicities, different marginalized communities, different oppressed communities, and how I think there are some overlaps in terms of our experiences, even though some, you know, some groups may have, everyone has their own unique experience, but overall, there is a lot of overlap in terms of how we are marginalized. And the more we can connect with one another and see that we might have similar experiences, the more we can hopefully band together and work towards um, erasing the the systems that oppress people. Um, Something that when I was watching this movie and Pavi's mentioned getting involved with that, the Black Panther protests for Huey. I remember last year I went to the screening of a teaser for a Black Panther documentary that someone is working on that's centered on the founding members of the Seattle Black Panthers. And something that was really notable was they had some of the founding members there on stage to talk about the film after they showed the preview. And one of them, he said, in the film, many people say power to the people, which is I think a well-known expression related to civil rights and things like that. And one of the founding members of the Seattle Panthers, he said, what we meant, and this is not a direct quote, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it's what I remember of it in my takeaway. Um, what he said is what we meant by power of the people, power to the people. Not everybody understands it, but what we meant is all power to all of the people, all of the time. He said it wasn't just about Black people, it wasn't just about Black men, Black women. We were there fighting for rights for everyone. And during that Panther event that I was at, it was one of the only public events where Palestine and genocide were brought up multiple times. Most places I go, nobody wants to talk about it unless you're specifically in like Middle Eastern groups. And at this Panther event, they brought this up over and over and over again. And they really demonstrated that they were talking about all power to all of the people, that they were advocating for the freedom of other people while they had the microphone in their hand. And I thought that was really incredible to join up with each other and fight for each other's experience and fight for each other's freedoms while we're fighting for our own, I think is really valuable. I thought that was a
Yeah,
powerful thing.
know the Sadi poem, which I'm going to paraphrase in very simplistic English. An injury to one is an injury to all, which is also the Longshoremen Union slogan. You know, when you harm one part of the body, you harm the whole body, right? If I could just follow up with a really important point
Sure.
about how different the moment we're living in is now. If you think about Parviz was the recipient, as was many other Iranians. In California, the Higher Education Act was passed in 1960, which meant that for the first time, California was making college and university very affordable for Californians. And as a result, it was also affordable for international students. We're now living in a very difficult moment for people to go to college because it's not very affordable. And the worst part is that we're making it very hard for young people from other countries to come and study here. And Iran is among the worst in terms of people being able to get a visa. And I can tell you, as a professor, I get emails 2, 3 times a week asking me, to help them or to guide them or to advise them on how to get a visa or do I have a program that they could get into? Because things are exponentially worse in Iran because of sanctions, the economic situation, corruption, and fear, anxiety about the future. It's very hard for Iranians to get a visa to come here. So we're kind of missing out also on the idea of being educated by young people in a university setting who are coming from other countries. And I've noticed it in my 25 years of teaching that there are far fewer international students who can afford to even go to a state university than previously. And I feel like it's one of the great sadnesses of my educational professional life is to see how one of the ways that we learn about other countries is to have students in our midst teaching other young people. And that was not the case in Parviz's day or some of the other people in the movie. They were encouraged to go study abroad. They were exposed to lots of things, but they also exposed Americans. And it fits in the same, this vacuum of representation is also enabled by policies that make it very difficult for people to travel to Iran or from Iran to here. We're kind of cutting off any opportunities to see each other. And I mean it in the most simplistic sense, to really see our common human story. And it sounds like a cliche, but it's not, you know? And that's why representations culturally of Iran really matter to people. It matters so deeply to them that they can see a picture of themselves on a screen, and it's like a tender, beautiful, not assaulting image, but like a human image, because there is so little in the media that's positive and there's so little, period. I mean, I'm going to tell you a little story about the film that I think is super important because I know we're running out of time. Uh, you notice that there's a lot of archival footage, and there's footage from a film in 1961 that was commissioned by the then Consul General of San Francisco, a man named Majid Rahnama, wanted to share the story of Nowruz with Americans. And he was aware that in 1961, a lot of Iranians were coming to the Bay Area to get education. So he commissioned this film. His neighbor was a woman named Mary Louise Stein. She was an aspiring filmmaker. He asked her, would you help me make this film? I want to educate Americans about Nowruz. That film came to me because in 2020, after Suleiman was assassinated by Trump 1.0, the media was all over it and that was like, okay, we're in World War III. We better ask some Iranians what they think about what's going to happen next. So suddenly I was flooded with phone calls and emails with interview requests about like, what did I think about the fact that Trump said he was going to destroy all these important Iranian historical sites like, Takht Jamshid or, Hafez's tomb, because he threatened that on social media. And I did the interview on CNN and I talked about this very thing about how like we never get any representation except when there's some bad stuff going down. And a gentleman named Peter Stein, who was the son of this filmmaker woman who lived next door to the Iranian consul general, he contacted me and said, I read your interview on CNN. Thank you so much for talking about how little we know about Iran and Iranians. I grew up next door to the Rahnama family. My two brothers and my brother and my sister, we were best friends with these kids who lived next door who were Iranians. We used to go eat at their house. They were lovely people. And then one day they weren't here because their dad got another mission as a, diplomat. And he said, I don't know what happened to them, but I have this film that my mother made. It's quite old. Would you like to see it? And I said, please. And he came and he shared it with me. It was on a crappy quality DVD. And I was like, oh my God, this is gold. Do you have the original print? And he said, yeah, you want it? It's in my garage. It's been sitting there for 45 years. You're welcome to it. I said, oh, please, I would love it. So he gave it to me, he gave it to the center, and I had it restored. And after I saw the film, I was like, oh my gosh, this has to be in the film. I'd already started working on the film with my colleague. And I was like, this is a piece of the same long arc of history. And it is really beautiful that this was made and it never got broadcast. I mean, I think it was shown and seen by a handful of people. Um, Anyway, Peter was very gracious in giving that to me, and that's part of the archive of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. And he said, I just regret that I lost touch with these people. I have no idea where they are. I don't even know if they're still alive. And I said, okay, do you remember their names? And he said, absolutely. I said, I'm going to find them for you. So I did a little bit of sleuthing on the so-called internet, found the sister. If you remember in the film, there's a little girl with a unibrow. That's Pune. She lives in Iran. Her older brother, Kaveh, lives in France, and another brother lives in the UK. So I contacted Pune on Facebook and I said, I don't know if you'll remember this person named Peter Stein, but he says he was your neighbor. He gave me a copy of a film that your father had commissioned. And right away, she wrote me back and said, oh my God, Peter Stein, can you put me in touch with him? And I said, absolutely. And then a few weeks later, I get an email from LinkedIn from the older brother, Kaveh, who says, I remember Peter, we were best of friends when we were kids. So I had the film restored. We did a screening online in Nowruz 2021. It was still the pandemic. And Pune joined us from Iran. Kaveh joined us from France. Peter joined us from the USA. We screened the film, and it was the first time these people had seen each other in almost 62 years. And it was a joy. It was a joy to see them reflect on their childhoods together. And it was like a reminder, like it wasn't always this terrible. It wasn't always this, Iran wasn't always this vilified. And people had experiences with Iran and Iranians that were very beautiful and positive. So last year, Pune was in the US and she came to the Bay Area and I set up a dinner with Peter and her and just seeing them embrace each other and talking about, what had happened in the last 65 years was beautiful. And just 2 days ago, I got an email from Kaveh, the older brother who lives in France, to me and Peter and said, guess what? After 11 months, I finally got a visa to come to the US. I want to see you, Peter, after so much time. And Persis, I'd like to see you if you're available. And I was like, that's the magic of what this work is. This is the magic, the beauty of archiving and searching and telling human stories. And that was it worth everything for me to see these people find each other and remember this time in which their lives were interwoven with one another.
That's absolutely incredible. Yeah, and that footage definitely really grabbed me early on in the film. And it kind of took me back. I still have a family photo album of old photos from decades ago, and some of the photos look not unlike to what we saw in that archival footage of just little kids dressed in antiquated clothing going to seize the Badar, and with parents who are also, I think dressed in more traditional clothing, even if we're in the US, like early days of coming to the US, and people still
Yeah.
dressing more Iranian. And some of my family came to the US around the 60s and 70s. And so somewhat similar era, somewhat similar clothing, similar photo quality really took me back. I thought that was beautiful footage.
Yeah, and it was just a gift, right? That it just happened to come into my possession through this accident of this bad news. This guy reaches out to me, and then it becomes a whole story in itself, which I wish I had filmed some of the,
Mm,
the interactions. But um, I think it's, like we need to tell those stories too. Those beautiful
mm.
connections shouldn't be erased by government narratives and by like the opportunistic way in which people cast each other in these very dark terms that erases all this other stuff that's human and tender and loving and kind.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned in our talk today and in the film, I think, Trump policies like the travel bans and whatnot were mentioned. And you've referenced it as Trump 1.0. And of course, here we are now in Trump 2.0, where new policies potentially are once again going to divide families or keep them from connecting in the first place, which my own family, my immediate family and extended family, we had multiple family members who had to come in waves because it took time to get approvals for visas and whatnot. So we were divided for years and eventually got approved. But of course, if I was here today with family still in Iran trying to immigrate and a travel ban was imposed, much like some of the people in your film, I would find myself in a situation where it's hard to reconnect. Do you feel like, is there anything you would add to this story if you were making it today? We're only just entering the second Trump administration, of course, so maybe it's too early to tell, but any reflections on how things have changed?
Oh, well, they've gotten worse. I mean, there's no question they're worse for Iranians, right? The
Yeah,
economy in Iran is just abysmal, and people feel a much more thin sense of hope post woman life freedom. I mean, there's been lots of executions. I mean, we always need to find hope and sustain hope and build hope. But I think it's a much darker time for both countries. And I think that's why we have to like find the beautiful stories and share them because that this is a time where dehumanization seems to be trumpeted. Sorry, no pun intended there.
that was good.
But the public cruelty and vitriol towards immigrants, towards what's happening in Palestinian lives in Gaza. Um, I wouldn't have ever imagined it in my lifetime to be this ugly.
Mm.
But that's also why I want to share this movie because it's a little tiny intervention in a moment where we need a little light and hope. And, like at several of the screenings I've done recently where people have come up to me and said, "Thank you for making this movie. It just moved me to tears. It made me feel seen, but it also helps me remember that history is not stuck in one mode. We have to help push it towards better times." And it's not even my story, but it is my story. It's your story. Like we all find something in it. And I think, one of the people who saw it yesterday said to me this morning, I had breakfast, it's a colleague. He said, I just see so many similarities with other immigrant groups from what you represented in that movie. And I think that's what good storytelling does. It doesn't single out or privilege one narrative. It captures many stories, an ocean of stories in it, and it makes it that you can't turn away from that. You can't be moved by it enough to maybe rethink some of your perceptions and uh, the narratives that you've been fed. So I hope it adds something new to the stories that are unfortunately being trafficked in. Uh, you
Yeah.
know, and I will say also, um, I'm like how I look for hope. I look to young people, and I see lots of ways in which young people uh, are not buying the stuff, neither in Iran nor here. They're just not buying it, and we don't know what's going to happen, but I trust them. I
That's
trust,
great.
you know.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I appreciate that. I don't know if we've come to an era where it's become popular to be down on youth, and we've always had the rhetoric of kids these days and back in my day. And I remember not too long ago being of a generation where older folks were talking bad about my generation. And now I'm of a generation where I see my generation growing up and talking bad about the next generation. And I just think that's a shame. I remember being in that position, and now it's us who are putting people in that position. That's Have we learned nothing? But I think having some optimism and faith in youth is important, and I have it as well. Yeah, I think respecting and appreciating youth and all the different generations and figuring out how we can come together.
I mean, they have a lot of courage. I mean, look at people in Iran. courageous and resilient and strong, even when it's really painful. And young people here, they just went through something pretty traumatic in the US around these protests, and I don't think it's over. I think we're in a very difficult time when authoritarianism seems to be on the rise throughout the globe, but I don't think it's over for any country. And I'm hopeful that young people will see what's at stake for them here too.
I feel much the same. Yeah. So I'm curious, how can people engage with you? Someone who might be watching or listening this, where can they find you online, whether it's your website or social media? And is there anything you want to plug? Like, are you working on anything else, or is there something people should Google to learn more?
Well, I think the most reliable thing right now is for people to go to the website, Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, see what we've done, see what we're trying to do as we close down um, June 30th. Um, Follow our social media at Iranian Diaspora Studies, which is Instagram. We have regular programming online. We're doing something March 5th for International Women's Day. A Washington Post reporter who covered the Woman Life Freedom protests from afar is going to be talking, Nilu Tabrizi. Um, I am trying really hard to archive everything. And, people have asked, how can we help keep the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies alive? I think it's a foregone conclusion that it won't exist at San Francisco State because there's no resources. It's something that I wish some visionary person with a good amount of resources would take up somewhere, maybe at an R1 institution. But people can also email me. I'm happy to talk individually about this film, ways to show it. It's not yet public. I'm working on a distribution plan. So right now, people can see it in a number of locations at film festivals, and probably we're going to do an online screening towards the end of the center's life. Um, if anybody wants to host a screening, we can also talk about that. So my email is my first and last name, Persis Karim at sfsu.edu. I'm really good at responding to people if they're, needing some advice or thoughts or want to engage. Um, those are the best things people can do. And I think also beyond this film, um, this is a moment for Iranians to step up and see their common experiences and common stories with other communities, especially Latino communities who are being singled out and victimized by anti-immigrant policies. But I hate to say it, we're next. The Trump travel ban is likely to come back. It may not look exactly the same. I worry for the future of diasporas need new energy. They need new organizing, they need new visions. So it doesn't have to be a university setting, but I want to encourage people to think about archiving these stories before people die. So if anybody wants to get a little advice about how to go about that, I think that's a really important thing. We need to claim our space in this history. And one of the ways you do that is to build archival resources for future generations.
Yeah, and just as we saw that gift of the 1961 footage that you found kind of by luck, we need that by intention for people who are doing this 60 years from now. We need a rich
And
archive
we
of.
need, we need to leave a trace of this story that's happening now. Um, and we need to do it in ways that honor all the nuance and complexity and even the pain,
Yeah.
because there is a lot of pain. And the best thing we can do is be honest with ourselves about all the things that have happened to us as individuals, as a community, as a diaspora, and to leave it in some fashion that people in the future will know what we went through and how we survived and what are some of the gifts that we're still passing along to others. And of course, Iranians are a very accomplished people, and I don't want to diminish that. I mean, they're very educated. They're incredibly artistic. The amount of artistic output blows my mind. And you see a little bit in the film. We need to celebrate that stuff, you know? I mean, it's great to share Nowruz, it's great to share Yalda, but there's a lot of other stuff too that lives inside us that is worthy of sharing and telling.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I would say your film features a lot of artists who are creating contemporary works, some of it that draws perhaps from Iranian traditions. I certainly saw some beautiful visual arts and whatnot, and recitations of poetry. And I certainly encourage people to watch the film. And locally, I know you're working with Payvand and SIFF and the University of Washington, specifically their MELC, the Middle Eastern Languages and Cultural Department, and the Center for Iranian Studies there. And your film is being screened on the 18th at UW Bothell and on the 19th at SIFF Uptown location, Queen Anne. And I'll make sure to include a link for where people can find information for that. It's on payvandnpo.org. I'll spell it out when I post this so that people can find the film. And I certainly encourage everyone to watch it.
Yeah, I really hope to see folks from Washington at those two screenings. I'm so honored that they're hosting two screenings, one in Seattle and one in Bothell, because I think, the more people see it, the more energy we get to like do this work and also celebrate the good stuff, right? That there's a moment in the film where Bella Warda, who's the actress, says, I don't want that stuff to disappear. I want to see it in my grandchildren because we brought a lot of good stuff with us. And she says it just like that. I know the line and I love it because it's like this is something to celebrate.
Absolutely. Yeah, that line resonated with me as well. Great. Well, Persis Karim, thank you so much for joining me today on Bent Fig Media and discussing your new film, The Dawn is Too Far: Stories of Iranian-American Life. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise. Take care.